Hi, it's KCCK's Culture Crawl. I'm Dennis Green, and my guest today via Zoom is author Larry Tye. Larry, welcome.
Great to be with you, Dennis.
Where are we talking to you from today?
You're talking to me from what used to be known as America's Playground, which is Cape Cod, Massachusetts, about 10 miles from where the Kennedy compound is.
Oh, okay. Well, nice to have you joining us remotely. You've written a new book called The Jazzmen, and it's about three people who are, very familiar to our audience and who we talk about a lot, but not in, through this lens. It's about Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, and Count Basie, but not about their music. About their, about their lives as black men in a time when being a black man was not easy. Not that it's easy these days either. But tell me how the project first came about.
So it came about with these extraordinary men who I interviewed 25 years ago, and they were called Pullman Porters. They were the black men that George Pullman hired just after the end of the Civil War to work on his sleeping cars. And they were known as being extraordinary service people who took care of you and made you feel really important on your long rides across America. But I argued in that book that these were also people who helped spawn today's black middle class in America. And the Pullman Porters insisted that when I get done writing a book about them, that someday I write a book about a guy named Satchel Paige, who may have been the most entertaining and the fastest guy ever to pitch a baseball. And then they wanted me to write about their three favorite passengers, who were three jazzmen named Ellington, Armstrong, and Basie. And what the Porters said, I did.
So was what is your area of, because you mentioned Satchel, you mentioned the Jazzmen and the Porters. What areas of interest do have you worked in, with your books?
So, Dennis, that's a polite way of saying there's no consistency in the 9 books that I've written. They range from books about Superman and Bobby Kennedy to books about Senator Joe McCarthy and Satchel Paige and the Pullman Porters. And if there is any consistency, it is that as a lifelong journalist, I'm a bit of a dilettante. I grab onto projects that are interesting to me and try to tell stories about the things that we think we know that have another side to them. So I wrote the 250th biography of Bobby Kennedy, but I argued that to understand Bobby Kennedy as the liberal icon that he ended up as, we had to understand him as the acolyte of conservative Senator Joe McCarthy, which he was. And I argued that to understand Ellington, Armstrong, and Basie, even beyond all the things that people had written in hundreds of books about them, that we had to understand that their most noble legacy may not be their music. It was what they did in opening up civil rights to Americans. And it was nobody less than Martin Luther King who explained that these guys set the table for what King did in bringing a civil rights revolution to America.
If you've studied the lives of musicians, mainly African American, and particularly in the jazz genre, we have lots of stories about they would play this giant hall in a great city, but they could not stay in the hotel, and so they would have to stay with a local family. And there are several families that I know here in our eastern part of Iowa whose parents and grandparents hosted Duke Ellington and Count Basie back in the day because they couldn't stay in a hotel. And I suppose we have this imagined idea that because they were big music stars, that it was easy for them. But that I'm sure was not the case.
So I'd love to say 2 things about that. You're exactly right that we have this image that life must have been easier for them, but all that mattered when they walked into the wrong restaurant or the wrong hotel was the color of their skin. And that was enough to get them not just in trouble, but in a bad situation to get them at the end of a hangman's noose. And I think that that is where the Pullman Porters helped me see them in a different light. The reason the Pullman Porters got to know these three musicians was that when Ellington, Armstrong, and Basie became successful enough and they had enough money in their pocket to do what they wanted when they traveled, when they would go below the Mason-Dixon line, and when their black skin was all that mattered, they would rent private Pullman sleeping cars to go with them. And rather than risk where after a late night concert they would go for a bite to eat or for a meal where they could be for a place to sleep where they could be safe, they would go back to the railroad siding where the Pullman car was just sitting there off the tracks, and the Pullman porters would feed them. They would take care of every need that they had in terms of whether their clothes needed to be ironed or whether they wanted a warm blanket. But what they would do that was most extraordinary of all is they would keep them safe. They knew that there was no risk of getting trapped in a dangerous situation, not just in the North, but not just in the South, but even in the North, where Jim Crow was not a matter of law, but was a matter of fact. They knew that in a Pullman sleeping car, they would be safe. And the reward was, in return for giving them this haven where they could go after their late night concert, the musicians were so grateful that they would perform concerts privately for the Pullman porters in the middle of the night in the closed capsule of the sleeping car. And I don't know about you, but the idea of being there with these acoustics of a sleeping car, hearing the greatest musicians on the planet play a private concert for you, it was no surprise to me that years later they would say to me, you got to write a book on these guys. And it was just one last thing I want to say on that, which is that, as you said, they were at great risk, no matter that they were three of the greatest musicians ever produced in America. But what they did that was different than fellow musicians who were Black or other entertainers was they didn't just accept the strictures of Jim Crow segregation. They helped break apart those barriers, and they left America a more equitable place than they had found it. And that is a legacy I think worth being proud of.
Well, and they don't get credit for that either. I know that there was a time in, for instance, Louis Armstrong's life when, he was told he wasn't doing enough for his fellow African Americans by other groups and other musicians. But what you're saying is that they really did do a lot. It was just kind of quiet and behind the scenes.
Yes. So again, you're being polite and you say that he didn't get the credit that he deserved. In fact, what he got was accusations of being an Uncle Tom. And the fact that he would go on stage with his white handkerchief and hamming it up for the crowd, people looked at him and said, you're a clown and you're doing that to appeal to white audiences. And first of all, Louis Armstrong never felt there was a contradiction between being an artist and an entertainer. Yes, he was doing a bit of hamming, but that was part of his act. And what he was also doing is blowing more high notes in a more the brilliant and magisterial way than any musician who picked up a trumpet before him had ever done, and I think than anybody has done since. But what he was also doing behind the scenes was he was insisting that in later life that his contracts not include the provision that he wouldn't play to segregated crowds. He was standing up. One of the most famous civil rights episodes in American history was in Little Rock, Arkansas, where after the Brown versus Board desegregation decision that said schools had to be on equal footing for whites and blacks, there was disruption. And the governor of Arkansas back then, a guy named Orville Faubus, said essentially what the George Wallace would say years later, which is, over my dead body will we integrate this school. And the kids were being spat at and shouted at, and Dwight Eisenhower wasn't doing anything to enforce the court order in the early days. And Louis Armstrong stood up and said, you are essentially a coward, President Eisenhower. Now, calling a coward not just your president, but the World War II leader of the Allied forces and the hero of World War II took a heck of a lot of courage. And anybody who thought that was what an Uncle Tom would do better relook at their dictionary and define what an Uncle Tom is. And repeatedly, in public ways and in much more often quiet, private ways, he was this insidious infiltrator of the Jim Crow system and left America much more equal than he found it. And I think that is something that he deserves. As much as he deserves all the credit for being the great musician he deserves the credit for being the great equalizer that he was.
I think I'm just going to ask you to tell a little story about each man involved in this, because I want to hear about all of them. But let's start with Count Basie, who when you were thinking of musicians who might have had a big impact on the civil rights scene. Basie might not be the first name that occurs to you, but he's in your top three, and I suspect not just because the Pullman Porters liked him.
Not just because of that. So Count Basie was the quietest of the three in terms of the way he behaved on the stage and the way he behaved behind the stage. But what people didn't know was in one club after another, it was Basie who made them open the club, not just to Black entertainers, but to Black patrons. And his wife worked for Martin Luther King. She was a fundraiser for all kinds of civil rights causes. And she was doing that with the Count's full backing and with the Count's open wallet. That basically he was there doing things that, in addition to making anybody who ever listened to him not be able to keep their toe from tapping, he was also ensuring that everywhere that he went would be opened up a crack or an entire door width to let in Blacks and to let in equal rights.
Duke spent most of his career in the New York City area, which again, we think of the Harlem Renaissance, we think of New York as being, very, very cosmopolitan and integrated, even, in the 30s and 40s. That did not keep Miles Davis from getting beaten up by a cop in the 50s, outside of, I think it was the Blue Note. But tell me about Duke's role.
So Duke's role, like the Count's, was a quiet one. Duke Ellington always said, I want to have my legacy be judged by the music that I play. But what people didn't realize at the time was the music that he was composing was the music of Black America. It was Black, Brown, and Beige, his famous opera that he performed at Carnegie Hall. It was songs that he called Negro music, and songs that told the history of Black Americans from the era of slavery to the era of beginning to assert rights to the whole civil rights movement. And my favorite song of him is one called The King Fit the Battle of Alabama. And fit was a colloquialism for fought, and it was basically saying Martin Luther King went down to Alabama. A guy named Bull Connor took his hoses and hosed down King, and he was a police chief in Birmingham, Alabama, and he used fire hoses on the demonstrators. And while the papers covered that as a civil rights demonstration, the one who put it into American culture, which is appropriate on a show called Culture Crawl, to understand that it was Duke Ellington who took it from the headlines to our music to ensure that it would be there forever. And in addition to what he did, again, like Basie and Armstrong, in bringing down racial barriers, it was enshrining the story of race in America into the story of Duke Ellington's music, which ensured it would be here forever.
The book is The Jazzmen: How Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, and Count Basie Transformed America by Larry Tye. Larry, this is fascinating. I could go on and listen to stories all day long, but then we wouldn't have any reason to buy the book. So what's the reception been for the book so far?
So the early reviews are in, and that means from the publications that go out there to libraries and to bookstores and others. And it has been what's called the starred review just about everywhere, which means the best that they give out. But as every author, I wait nervously and assume that the next review is going to trash it. And so far, that hasn't happened. So I appreciate your having me on, and I appreciate the good reviews so far.
Well, I have my copy and just got it the other day, though. So I'm, just a few pages in, but a great read so far. Larry, good luck with the book. If you ever make it to Iowa, I hope that you'll stop by and say hello, and we'll learn about your progress and your latest projects. And thanks again for telling this story.
Thank you for having me on.
You can hear the Culture Crawl live on the radio many weekdays at 10:30 or download the podcast at kcck.org/culture. You can watch a video of this interview on our Facebook or YouTube channels. Our producer is Lydia Kilgore. I'm Dennis Green. I'll talk to you later.